You look weary. Come closer. I am the teller. Tales of wonder. Tales of light and dark. There are all manner of stories here. So come, sit by the fire. Let me tell you a story.
The Cross of Clive. When the war broke out, Clive was given the same choice as every other able-bodied man, woman, and child. You can serve your country in glorious combat, ridding the world of tyranny, prejudice, and darkness, or you can deny this call to action and serve out the war in prison or working in the munitions production factories rising up around the country. The war would be long, and any country could take the advantage and turn the tide if they were better stocked and supplied than their enemies. Clive had always been a religious man, a man of faith, a man who believed in a higher purpose, a higher calling. Clive believed that all men had been created equal, and no man or being other than God himself had the right to choose or influence the demise and end of another man's life. This was a belief that had been entrenched into his psyche since childhood. It was in his bones, his bloodstream, the very fibre of his being. Clive could not and would not support any conflict of any kind outside of careful and considered verbal conflict, and even then he would defer to a man of the cloth or the good book for guidance in such matters. As such, when the war broke out and the people of Clive's sleepy village in the Midlands of England were called into the town square and asked to pledge their allegiance to Queen, country, and the British way of life, Clive refused. He was the only one in his village who did. At first, the soldiers sent to collect the next wave of troops thought his proclamation of religious exemption from the conflict was an ill-advised attempt at humour. After all, the priest himself, a young man of 32, was the first in the village to offer himself to the glorious war effort. Not only this, Clive was but a man of 23, and his quiet and stoic admission and commitment to his religion was unusual for a man of his few years. But after repeated questioning, prodding, and ordering, the soldiers came to realize that this young man was serious. He would not, could not fight. Thus Clive was led into the small car that had brought the sergeant in charge of rounding up the future soldiers. They had not expected any resistance in volunteers. Not in this part of the country anyway. Long years of financial hardship and lack of governmental oversight had led to widespread unemployment, poverty, and a lack of direction for the male workforce. Everyone they had come across had jumped at the chance to fight for their country, and more importantly, be paid to do so. As Clive was handcuffed and placed in the back of the sergeant's car, the crowd of his fellow villagers gathered and watched. Men, women and children he had grown and lived alongside for years, watched as Clive was driven away. They felt nothing for his singular act of protest. They saw no honour or righteousness in his decision. Neither did they feel anger that he chose to flee from combat, while so many of their village joined up. Instead they watched the young, quiet Clive disappear over the hill in the back of that sergeant's car, and they wondered if they had just witnessed the war's first casualty. They hadn't. Clive was driven 40 miles to an old bread factory, which a mere month after the war's announcement had been quickly retrofitted into a munitions factory. Bullets, bombs, bandoliers, knives, grenades, all would be made here by women who could not serve, children not yet old enough to fight, and those like Clive who refused under the will of God. Clive was led through the factory and shown where he would be working. The small assembly line once home to fresh-baked white bread and baps, now housed gunpowder, metal casings, and an array of tools meant to carve and construct tools of death and destruction. He was taken to his accommodation in a small metal shack in the lifeless concrete area behind the warehouse. He would be sharing it with 6 others, all prisoners or conscientious objectors like him. Those who came to work here lawfully were allowed to return to their families at the end of the day. That first night, while his fellow shack inhabitants slept, Clive sat restless and worried. He had avoided the conflict, yes. He would not have to face the prospect of inflicting violence upon another human being physically. He wouldn't have to shoot, cut, blow up, burn, or strangle the life out of another man. But he was still here in this place, in a factory that's sole purpose was to steadily provide the tools to do so. What could he do? Clive did not have the constitution for prison, a real prison. He knew that despite the rest of its inhabitants being there for real crimes, somehow he would still be the worst of the worst in their eyes. A man who turned his back on his country and its flag in its greatest hour of need. It would be viewed as equivalent to crimes inflicted upon children. Clive sat on his threadbare mattress and peered through the only window in the shack. It was small, square, and smeared with grime. Clive sat and he prayed. Clive prayed to his God. Clive prayed to his God for guidance. He had done so many times in his life. Whenever he needed guidance, assurance, or comfort, he would hear the words of the Father reverberate through him. On this night, in this dark shack, he felt no divine presence. And for the first time in his short life, Clive felt so very alone. Over the next few weeks, Clive did what was asked of him. He was awoken at 6 a.m, rising with the dawn sun. He and his fellow shackmates would have a silent breakfast of bread, water, and the occasional brown apple if the guards were feeling generous. Then they would each be allotted a 2-minute turn under an ice-cold hose to bathe. There was no soap or washcloth, just ice-cold water and one shared towel that by the end of the group's communal use would be as cold and comfortless as the shower itself. Then the men were led to the factory, and from 7 a.m. until 7 p.m. they would work their stations. Clive would sit on a rickety, uncomfortable wooden chair at his section of the assembly line. He would take the empty shell casings, fill them with gunpowder, then using a clamp and pliers, tighten the sharp head onto each bullet. He would toss the completed bullet into a bucket next to him. Throughout the 12-hour days, Clive could manufacture on average at least 1 bullet every 5 minutes. This was roughly 144 bullets a day. 144 bullets. 144 pieces of metal that could do damage and deal out death. That was over 1,000 potential deaths on Clive's conscience. He tried to put this thought out of his mind as he worked. But with every sprinkle of gunpowder, every twist of the bullet tip, he saw images of broken and split flesh. Young men splayed out on an anonymous battlefield somewhere, dead by the tools fashioned with his own hands. It ate away at Clive. Every night Clive would lay restless in the shack, while his exhausted workmates slept soundly. Clive prayed for a sign from his God every night, a tiny action or wordless message that would point him in the right direction. But every night, none would come. Until the first night of his 2nd month in the shack. Whilst the men around him slept, Clive was on his knees. He was close to breaking point. That day he had made the most bullets he ever had. He had gotten so used to the process, he was averaging 2 bullets every 5 minutes now, effectively doubling his output and circumstantially building his potential body count. Clive was distraught, lost and desperate. Suddenly Clive felt awash with a deep, bright light. He opened his eyes and looked through the window across the shack. A bright white light shone through the thick dust and grime that caked the windows. But how? There were no external lights on the warehouse or the shack. Then it could only be a sign. The sign he'd been waiting for. Clive opened up his arms and let his head backwards, allowing the light to wash over him. Without a sound or word, he knew what his God was telling him. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, Clive was electric with a new and renewed sense of purpose. He rose early and took his breakfast with a hearty glee. He allowed his fellow shackmates to use the hose before him, no longer dismayed by the soaking wet towel as he dried himself. He marched to his section in the warehouse, a smile on his face and faith buoying his heart. He sat on his wooden chair, its instability no longer a burden on his back or mind. Clive began his work exactly as he usually did. He grabbed an empty shell casing, poured in the gunpowder, fixed the tip with the clamp and the pliers. But before placing it in the bucket, Clive stopped. Grabbing a small knife from the toolbox that had until now gone unused, he stuck the tip into the bullet's head. Dragging it across the bullet, he made 2 lines in the shape of a cross. You see, when Clive was bathed in light the previous night, he heard what his God wanted. Clive needed to bless every bullet he made. For every bullet Clive etched with the symbol of the Lord God would pass from whatever weapon it was expelled from, and pass by its intended target. The ever-loving and watchful Father would stop it from claiming a life, stop it from shattering worlds with the puncturing of skin, the tearing of flesh, the shattering of bone. Clive knew that he could not stop every bullet that left this factory from doing so. But at the very least, none from his hand would ever cause harm and death. And with this knowledge, with this self-assured confidence, Clive worked happily and quietly in that warehouse for the duration of the war. What Clive didn't know was that by the act of cutting into his bullets, by marking them with the symbol of his saviour, he had unintentionally made bullets that were far more dangerous and more damage-inducing than any other. Every bullet marked with the Cross of Clive, upon impact shattering into pieces, fragmenting into bodies. Simple flesh wounds became grievous and fatal. Ricochets that would have glanced off rock and concrete became tiny grenades that buried in skin and caused infection. Bullets that would have lodged in muscle to be later safely removed became deadly puzzle pieces slicing through veins and arteries. Without knowing it, Clive had created weapons that caused more injury, death, and took more lives on the opposing sides and turned the tide of the conflict. In a way, Clive's action brought about the end of the war quicker than if he had made them like everybody else in munitions factories across the country. Clive never knew this, for he so believed in the light that bathed him in the shack that night, so believed in the beauty and majesty of his Lord and Saviour, he never even realised that the light was merely the torchlight of a patrolling guard who thought he had spotted movement in the shack that night. Wake up. Dream hands claw at me when I try to wake from my slumber. Often they pull me back in for a further venture into the lucid labyrinth of my unconscious mind. The hands, mostly hostile, other times cloying and gentle, grip my limbs with a vice-like hold. They are not strong enough this morning, and thus I wake fully, eyes bleary and mouth dry. The crack in the cheap wooden blinds that hang haphazardly from the wall to my right allow pinpricks of languid grey light to sneak in. The room is lit nonetheless, cascaded clothes crumpled in a coil at the foot and sides of my bed, each a signpost of fatigued late-night disrobings from throughout the week. I swing my legs over the bed, straightening my back with arms reaching for the ceiling above. Creaking bones crack and tense with my rising breath, falling short when a cough ekes its way through my chest. A shooting pain through the soles of my feet push me upwards. Any more delays and I'll be late. Doors open and close and I find myself in the cramped, damp-smelling bathroom I share with 3 others. A myriad of used toilet rolls and empty shampoo bottles cram themselves into the small crevice behind the toilet. A small supermarket bag sits next to them hollow, waiting to be filled. It won't. I look in the small cracked mirror above the sink, eyes red and bloodshot from the night before. I grip the tap, bringing it upwards. Nothing comes except a beleaguered sigh from my own mouth. The water must be turned off every night, otherwise the leak in the second floor bedroom and this very bathroom will cause this tinderbox model home to crumble to the ground. I open the door and inspect the house for signs of life or sound. I look at myself, stark naked, pale, a small emerging beer gut obscuring the base of my penis. Do I risk it? Laughing, I make my way down the stairs. I don't care who sees this. I know it's so disgusting, any reactions akin to that emotion will be of no shock to anyone involved in any altercation. The hollow wooden boards that make up the stairs creak and wheeze under my feet, dust and animal hair and dead skin shooting up with every impression on the boards. I reach the kitchen and, approaching the sink, open the damp, riddled cupboard doors below it to reveal the network of pipes and switches that control the house's water supply. Reaching in, I turn a large red handle towards myself, it straining against the years of rust that surrounds its joints. I complete the turn and the water is allowed to flow freely through the house. Liquid salvation. Standing, I run the bent kitchen tap, 3 small holes at its spout, the only remains of its assault from a saucepan some weeks prior. The water is murky and lukewarm. Shutting it off, I climb the stairs again, each step bringing back closer the start of the day ahead. Another day, another minimum wage paycheck, and 14 hours spent outside this house. The work is long, hard, and uncelebrated, but it must be done. It must be done to keep myself and the other occupants of this house alive, despite their own insistence of never raising a finger in physical activity that might provide some financial reparation. Oh well, this is what I signed up for, is it not? To live amongst the scum and squalor, the low folk of the world. I stand in the bath once again and run the shower, holding the head above me as it weakly trickles the same lukewarm swill that ran from the kitchen tap. Instead of waking me and setting me up for a day, it only seeks to push me further into the languid pit of despair and sluggishness I feel enveloping me from the inside out. What if I were to remain? What if I were to simply not go? Instead of exiting the house and riding the rickety 30-year-old bus 45 minutes away to labour in anonymity below the surface of the earth, I stayed here. Stepped out from under the water dousing me and slipped back under the threadbare covers of my bed and simply refused to join the ever-spinning wheel of suffering that existed one step outside the door. Well, nothing would happen in the immediate aftermath of the decision. But with every passing minute that turned into hours, that turned into days, would prompt questions about my whereabouts. Phone calls, not yet frantic, but probing nonetheless. Where could he be? Does anyone have his landline? His mobile goes straight to answer phone. All the while their wanderings would never reach me. No, I would be ensconced in a protective barrier of solitude. I could open all the windows, shove a towel in the crack under the door, move the armchair to bar anyone entering it, and simply smoke, 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 and smoke. Let the television play endless reruns of that American sitcom I hate but has over 100 episodes, so it can merely be the salve that keeps my brain from burning itself up. Then perhaps as night falls, sneak down into the kitchen and take the last bottle of wine that was earmarked for a special occasion that would never arrive, and drink it in its entirety. Stain my lips and teeth with the evidence of my theft and my own foolishness. Perhaps the other occupants would knock on the door now and then, inquiring about my well-being, but they too would soon lose interest when their own desire for intoxication outweighed their concern for me. I do not blame them. How could I? They are simply me in another form, born on another day, in another time and another place. For that is all we are, tiny limbs on a vast and uncaring spirit, spinning endlessly through a void in time and space, desperately believing that we are individuals, and that everything we've ever felt, thought or done was unique and special to us. I struggle to breathe as the open windows no longer provide fresh air in which to propel my body through another second of life as the room closes in around me. I clench my eyes shut as the light emanating from the TV grows from mild damaged LEDs to a blinding pure white of clarity as I realise it's time to get up for work. Hope someone's already turned the water on.